Hello class, Professor Tweed here, and if you've been watching my videos recently, you've seen that I've had several on color theory and how to use them for design. And I recommend checking those out. The links will be in the description. And ultimately what I did is I showed how color theory is based off patterns, and once you understand those patterns you can better use it for design and create your own color palettes for your own work. What I want to do in this video is just have a little follow-up, because although I spent a lot of time on color theory, quite honestly, color theory is not the only thing you need to think about when you're thinking about color in your work. And so I wanted to follow up with this epilogue about a few other points that you might consider when you're designing. So the first thing I want to talk about is fashion. Now the interesting thing about fashion, of course, the thing that defines it is that it's always changing. It changes pretty quickly. And it can be even hard to stay up on top of these things. So one way that I like to do it is I like to go to Pantone. Now Pantone is a company that sets strict standards for colors, and they're also known for setting their color trends. And what they do is they basically gather a bunch of designers together every year. They talk about it and they pick a color of the year. I apologize if you're watching this after 2019, which is when I'm recording. That's the last date that I have in here. In 2019, the color was Living Coral, and you can see up there on screen the ones from the past years, and it is true 2016 did have two colors. It's sort of the exception that proves the rule, I guess. But anyway, their color selection, it tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because what happens is other designers see that they've chosen the color of the year and then begin to use it in whatever products or drawings that they're making. Especially, someone like an architect like myself, we've got many things to think about, and so for making a drawing, it's just quick and easy to go here. I will use that rather than trying to think, do I know what the fashion is? No, I don't know what the fashion is. I'm a middle-aged architect. Of course I don't know what the fashion is. And I will say that fashion does change quickly, so as an architect I would probably caution a little bit about using color of the year in a building, because buildings are meant to last a long period of time. Buildings will far outlast any color of the year, any fashionable trend. That said, you might choose to use colors in drawings which might only be needed for a week, or even in paint colors that you can easily repaint on a wall. So 2019, the color is called Living Coral. Let's just take a quick look at that. What I have here is I have a color wheel, much like what I've shown in previous videos, how to use it to create a color palette. And so Living Coral, it actually is a pretty close color to red, so I have it up there in the red zone. And I said, okay, let's just for demonstration purposes, let's look at a color palette. So I just sort of started by picking a complementary color down in cyan, and then I picked two similar colors to a blue, towards blue and towards green on each side of that. That creates my color palette, which, I was sort of going simple and saying, okay, Living Coral, let's make something that looks sort of watery or ocean-like, and the color works pretty well. Talking about my theory that I reviewed in the other videos, you can see the pattern's pretty clear. It's A, B, B, A pattern around the color wheel. Pretty simple. Of course, there's lots and lots of different color palettes you could make using Living Coral. I just wanted to give one example of what that might be. Go ahead and explore some yourself, and always keep checking back with Pantone to see what their current color of the year is. Of course, fashion is not the only consideration you need to give. There are some other things you might be thinking about. And on the opposite end of fashion is what I would call sort of human cultural preference. And so I do believe that across time and even across culture, there are things that people tend to like, and color tends to be one of them. There's actually been many studies done on color. This is sort of a representation of one. Not surprisingly, what we find is that blue, being the largest zone on this chart here, blue is the most preferred color of people just generally. It's followed closely by green and purple and red, and it sort of goes down from there. And way at the top, it might even be hard to see, there's a little brown area, basically saying brown is the least preferred. And I do think people generally do have generalized preferences across culture. Now similarly, we can look at the opposite of that, or what is the least preferred color options. Not surprisingly, this is almost an invert of what the preferred is. So brown is the least preferred color sort of globally, and blue is the least preferred, does that make sense, color up there which it must be if it's usually preferred. And so most of this second chart is the reverse of the first, although I find it interesting to point out there are some differences. So for example, black and whites, they tend to not be too high on the preferred. They're also not too high on the least preferred. I guess that means they're sort of middle ground to most people. They don't think about them a lot. Though I do, of course, think it's important. This is just statistics. Everyone has their own favorite color, right? And it might be different from these. I don't even like to use the word favorite color. I don't like to pick one myself because I think all colors are useful and all colors have their place. I've certainly used brown tones in many situations. They do make sense. I've also used blue in many situations and all colors in between. Now, just briefly, I also want to talk about culture, and certain colors have meanings in culture. And I think culture sort of falls, at least for this discussion, somewhere in between fashion, which is quick and changes often and everywhere, and human preferences, which change not really at all. And the culture sort of doesn't really change fast. It might change slowly, but it doesn't change fast, although it might be different place to place. So I'll be sort of talking mainly about American culture. Colors tend to have meanings in culture, which I think is sort of interesting. So I'm going to start off with this one, which is blue means boys and pink means girls. I think those things are changing. And there are other ones as well. So for example, white is good and black and evil is quite common. I find a sort of an interesting pair is love. Love is red. At the same time, anger is also usually done in reds. I find it fascinating that generally it's the same color, yet they almost have opposite meanings to each other. So colors can mean many different things. And there are many others, so I'm just going to animate a few more here. I'm not going to go over each one, and it's only actually a small handful of them. You can find many different words and meanings that come with colors. It's not always just single colors that have sort of a meaning to them. Groups of colors can also have meaning, so I'm going to call these themes. On the left-hand side, I have what I call neutrals. It sort of goes with anything. It can be restrained. It can almost be boring. You know, they're tans, they're light browns, they're grays. Like if you want to be unexciting, if you want to sort of have don't want to offend anybody, you might go with these. It's almost too easy. Next over, of course, we have pastels, which are often thought of to be soft and simple. They're hues that have a lot of white in them, and they're often thought of child or like baby. They can be used in those settings like that. In the middle, I'm just saying mixed, which is really just flexible. It goes with anything. I just have a variety of tints and shades and hues, and they can all sort of work together. It's what most work is. But then as we go over to the right, we have high contrast, which is bold and attention-getting. And way over there on the right, I'm calling it deep, which are darker colors. And those are often associated with rich and sophisticated things, royalty, things like that. So if that's what you're working on, hotel or something like that, you really might want to think about rich, deep colors. So last sort of point I want to talk about today is talk about contrast, because I think that contrast sort of is very important in any work, especially in color. And you want to hit a sweet spot, as I'll say, or that middle column, which I call just right. Now, contrast works off of tints and shades, and it works off of hues. And this one, we're just looking at tints and shades or blacks and whites. So on the left column, there's not enough. I can't see each of those red squares. They have the word contrast in them. On the left-hand side, you might hardly be able to see them on this. Right in the middle, I've sort of picked a middle zone. I think it's quite easily readable. And way over there on the right, I'm arguing that it's too high. Again, if you're trying to be bold, it's not too high. But if I have a lot of contrast, with like a bright hue with a lot of black or a bright hue with a lot of white, as is on the bottom, and I've got a lot of design patterns going on, it can be very difficult to read or it can be very difficult to see. So you want to be careful about it. And the same thing can also happen with hue, right? So here I've got the same thing, except for I've changed the word contrast to similar hues. On the left-hand side, the top one has an orange word contrast in it, and the bottom has sort of a magenta one, and they're very difficult to read. You know, in the middle, I picked colors that work pretty well, and then on the right, we've got green and cyan, which are complementary or contrasting colors to red, depending on what system you're using. And while, again, you can read the words, if you actually have a lot of words up there, a lot of design content up there, those colors can get hard for the eye to read. So you want to be careful if you're using too high of contrast. Contrast, although typically relates to color, I think the same thing applies generally in design. You want to make things stand out, but not stand out so much that it becomes problematic. So it's just a good lesson to learn and a good way to practice is in color. Well, I'm about going to wrap this video up now. This is just the drawing that I made, and I figured I'd throw it up on the screen because it's got some interesting colors in it as a drawing. And colors can be quite beautiful. So even though, like myself, I wasn't really trained on colors, I hope everyone out there can begin to use colors more in their work, and I hope they had fun watching these videos. So thanks for watching, and while you wait for the next video, keep making great designs and keep making great drawings.